Welcome everyone who's joining our death experience design webinar. We're going to just give people a couple of minutes to roll in, grab a couple of, sandwiches or tea, and we'll probably get going in the next maybe 3 minutes. People are joining pretty fast. I think we've got 35 of you in here so far. Really, really lovely to see everyone. So maybe just a little bit of housekeeping that I'll repeat in a second as well. And hello, Andrea is beating me to it. She's using the chat to say hello. I think everyone who is joining us today should definitely feel free to do the same. Hi, Andrea. Lovely to see you. We've got someone called, and Andrea, you're from Lima in Peru. Awesome. And Larry Quick, hello. So in the chat function, please feel free to say hello, introduce yourself, have a little commentary about what we're talking about. And we have a couple of people that are behind the scenes working to help us today. So we've got Haley, and Haley is going to be on tech support. So if you've got any questions for her, post them in the channel and we'll chat. We'll be taking Q&A right at the end of our conversation today. So there's separate to the chat function, there's a Q&A box in Zoom. If you've got a question, a comment, please pop it there, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end today to go through and bring those to the fore for our panelists. If you've got a technical support question or comment, please reach out to us on the chat and Haley will help. All right. Hi, Jensine from the Sunshine Coast, and Ellen from Michigan, USA, and Jennifer and Catherine Bell from Canberra, which is also where I'm from. Hello. Well, let's kick it off. Everyone, thank you so much for coming to our Deaf Experience Design in 2020 webinar. I'm beaming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and our panelists are joining from different places around Australia, including the lands of the Cammeraygal people and the Gundungurra people. And our panelists, who you'll meet later today, we'd all like to pay our respects together to elders past, present, and emerging from these nations. And I think in the context of discussing death is an important acknowledgement that I also would like to make. So Portable has been thinking and designing for a better death experience since 2018. And in all that time, I still have not felt any confidence to talk about what this experience has been or currently feels like from the lens of our diverse First Nations people. And I feel this lack of confidence from my heart, and I'd really like to connect and extend an invitation to anyone in our current conversation or anyone who knows anyone who wants to talk about this, because we recognize that no death experience that we can design will be complete without these perspectives. So with that, a little bit about the themes today. Many of the experiences that go along with growing old, getting sick and dying are never going to be great, but they can be a lot better than they currently are. I'm Sarah, I'm the head of strategy at Portable, and I have been designing for a better death experience since 2018. But if you've come here to see Howard, flying coffins and virtual reality funerals, I don't think we're going to offer that today, because the future will have more technology. But redesigning death and aging starts with a very wide and a very human lens. A whole series of experiences that currently occur as we grow old, get sick and die are very much more unpleasant and frustrating and painful than they need to be. So equally or more so for the people who are close to and caring for the people who are dying. And we want to make these experiences better. Here's the deal. We are all end users of the death experience one day. So what can we learn about ourselves from this crazy year that helps us design death better in the future? With me to explore this topic, three fantastic panelists. We have Melissa Reeder, CEO of Violet, formerly known as Life Circle. Violet is a national social enterprise and has the purpose to positively impact the way people experience the last stages of life. Melissa and her team are taking a successful community model built over 25 years to support families when someone that they love were in the last stages of their life. Now Violet needs to scale that to meet the needs of vast more number of Australians, and we're doing that through technology and partnerships so that this community model can be delivered to the people that need it. Welcome, Melissa. And we also have Dr. Hannah Gould. Hannah is a researcher with the University of Melbourne's Death Tech team. It's a mouthful. I love saying it, Death Tech team. Hannah is a cultural anthropologist and has experience effects of the death of the pandemic on a global scale this year. And we have Stephanie Longmuir. She's the host of Dying to Tell podcast, a funeral celebrant, and the founder of My End Notes. My End Notes is a digital platform that helps put in place funeral instructions and wishes. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to hearing about, because it's definitely a need and part of how we, bring death literacy into the conversations and also into our own hearts. Stephanie has been working in this space for the last 10 years, and she'll be telling us directly from her own lived experience what 2020 has been like in Australia. So with that, I'll hand over to Melissa to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Portable for having us, and great to be here with such fantastic co-panelists. And just a big shout out to everybody that's joining from quite a few different parts of this country and others. Fantastic to have such a strong response to what can be quite a difficult topic for some people to step into and think about quite closely. And I think it's fair to say that this issue has such ripe potential to be improved. It's not an area that we have seen a lot of innovation, a whole lot of change in this country or in others at that scale. And I think there's a real appetite, for improvement and for really a level of disruption. And I'll talk to that a little bit more. But what we know, I guess, and I'm pretty sure everybody on this session would agree that largely people aren't having the experience that they would wish to have or that they deserve to have. There's a lot of research to back that up, but what we see is there are so many stories to back that up. In my work every day, in conversations, in community or in boardroom, people share their stories, and it talks a lot about regret and this really important gap that we're really interested in, which is the gap between what people hope for and what happens. So that's really our area of focus, and I think it's a big and deep part of the human problem at the last stage of life and of death and of dying. And Sarah asked me to talk a little bit about, why is that? What are the problems that sit in that gap? They're pretty complex and they're pretty confronting for many. But right above that is, we just don't have a lot of mental models for success around what could this experience look like for people, for individuals, for families, in communities, in businesses. We really haven't done that work particularly well as a community. We don't have a strong sense of that. And there aren't really enough attractive alternatives to kind of flavour that and give us some ideas and some opportunities that we would want to explore on our own terms, in terms of what our preferences are and the kind of people that we are. And I wouldn't use the language in this conversation of what would good look like, because I think a good death is quite subjective and actually may not fit comfortably with a lot of people in the community, in the population. But you kind of picked up on this in your intro, Sarah, but I think it's about recognising that this experience of the very last stage of life and of death and of dying for people may never actually be good, but it can absolutely be better than what we have today. There is so much work to be done. We're really interested in the problem space around the non-clinical aspects of this issue. We think that's where most work has to be done. And from Violet's perspective, a big piece of this is actually about recognising this is a life stage. This is the last life stage, and we don't have a name for that. We don't know how to really plan for it, talk about it, recognise it. So that's a big missing piece of the pie from Violet's perspective, recognising the last life stage. We've become so very good at life stages, through our whole journey, but this last one seems to be really under-recognised and poorly planned for. And as a result, people aren't really able to consistently recognise and communicate when people enter the last stage of life. In fact, a lot of the system, and I think it would be fair to say some parts of the clinical system, actually avoid doing that. They work around it. Now, some parts of it are very, very good, but it's not consistently well done. There is a lot of avoidance. And I know from a kind of deeply personal perspective, and I hold this through my experience of caring for my first husband quite a few years ago, people actively try and stay upstream of the reality of that last life stage. And what I mean by that is it's so much easier to think, if I'm caring for my mum, that my mum's going to at least stay as well as she is today, and maybe she'll even get better. But it's very, very hard to do that work around understanding and acceptance that actually my mum is now in the last stage of her life. And what does that mean for us, and how do we talk about that and plan for that to make sure that that gap for mum between what she would hope for and what happens can be far reduced, and she can have the experience that she would want to have. So broadly, we know it's a really difficult topic, not for everybody, but for many to step into and to talk about. There's really quite poor planning and preparation and support, and this concept of guidance, which we feel quite committed to. There's no kind of one place to turn to that you can get that support and from a trusted source. And interestingly, the prevailing focus when we look at this experience is it's really clinical, and that's for all the right reasons in so many cases around different aspects of palliative care or symptom management, but it's not just a clinical issue. It has deep non-clinical needs. It has real human and social and emotional needs. And we need to get better as a society at recognising that. So as I said, Violet's job is to close what we're calling the regret gap. And we are taking all of that wisdom of our former model into a whole range of programs and products and tools to start to act like an early intervention system to really prevent regretful outcomes for people in the last stage of life. So that looks like, things from care planning through to referrals into that last life stage, through to guided support programs and through to workforce training. But, it's such an interesting point in time that we're having this conversation today. Again, you've picked up on some of that, but 2020 has been a strange, very strange year, which actually gives us a lot of opportunity in this space for a couple of reasons, big meta reasons, like we know we've got an ageing population, we know we're living longer. That doesn't mean we're necessarily living better. We know that the number of people dying in this country, in Australia alone, will double over the next 20 years. So the need is huge today, and it's going to be significantly bigger than that going forward. And disease types are changing, so that's really having an impact on the way that last life stage is playing out for people. We've got an increasing awareness around what this concept of frailty means to elderly people in the last life stage and how that can help us to understand that experience. We've got an interesting and somewhat contentious policy landscape that we're very aware of as we dive into this work, from the emergence of voluntary assisted dying in other countries and more recently here in Australia, led by our Victorian movement. We've got a Royal Commission into aged care, and we've got this, global pandemic, which is really, I'm not going to go into that because you all know you know what that's meant for all of us, but it has meant that we have had to stop and perhaps think about our mortality in a way that we haven't been forced to previously. We've had to consider planning around people's end of life in a way that we haven't necessarily had to do with such clarity. And we've seen the impact of the pandemic on the elderly frail in residential aged care with such potency, which I think has been very, very frightening for so many people. So, the problem is there. It has a lot of complexities. It's got a lot of parts of the jigsaw. No single organisation can solve this alone. It's very much a multi-factor approach, but it goes deep. It's about people's behaviours. It's about people's values. It's about gaps in the system. It's about mindset shifts. And it's really important, I think, to recognise that currently today, the system's just not well set up for this particular experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having for telling us so much, not only about Violet and what you exist to do, but also opening up a little bit about yourself, Melissa. I think that demonstrates something that's really important for me to try and connect back to. Is, as much as this is a professional interest, it's very much a personal interest, and I think a lot of people who come into the industry feel the same. But thank you for really broadening that landscape out for us. I'd like to turn to you next, Hannah, just to pick up on that thread and take us through the more recent research and maybe finish up with what this means for the people who work in the industry in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mel, for that wonderful kind of really, I think, scene setting and introducing us to the moment of death and dying in Australia and what we face kind of in the next couple of decades. So yes, as I said, my name's Hannah Gould. I work with the Death Tech research team at the University of Melbourne. So we're a group of social scientists working on problems of death, technology and social change, particularly around the cemetery, but also the funeral or death care industry more broadly. And I suppose over the last couple of months, I've been leading a project about COVID-19 and specifically about its impact on those working in the death care sector, particularly the lived experiences of people working in the pandemic. So this has involved a nationwide survey of people working in the death care sector, which I hope I can pass on in the chat later for anyone who's an industry member. So an anonymous survey of people's views and experiences. We've also conducted qualitative interviews with close to 50 different people, particularly in the Victorian industry. And we've just launched a portraiture photography project, portraits of the pandemic of those workers working on the kind of end line, front line, as it were, of care, which is all really exciting. So I have been swimming in this topic of death care and COVID for the last 6 months, and really excited to share some of those results with everyone soon. So I'm going to be a bit bold and begin by proposing a way of thinking about 2020, which I think will be useful for people thinking about engaging with designing death care practice. And that is that this year has been one in which people have come to feel both global interconnectedness and disjuncture or disconnection more deeply than ever before, and often simultaneously on different scales or levels of experience. So we have the once assumed intimacies between bodies, communities and nation states being met with newly instated borders. COVID has rooted people and objects in place. At the same time, new pathogens make the kind of fundamental borders between human bodies really appear permeable and vulnerable. And that raises the prospect of contagion, and we need to bolster these borders through PPE, etc. I want to take this as a starting point because I think death care is very much about bodies and borders, and about shepherding people across moments of great transition. We, in anthropology, my home discipline, we like to think of death as a rite of passage, right, as a transition. And the thing about transitions or movements between different stages is that they're always powerful and they're always potentially dangerous in some ways. And I think that the transition between aging and dying, actively dying, and death and memorialisation within the context of COVID has just become doubly dangerous and powerful because of this uncertainty. So I'm sure many of us living in Australia are aware that, you know, the COVID disruption to death has been really expansive and perhaps, I think, unexpected in many ways. We have, on the one hand, really smaller numbers of people able to attend funerals. Briefly, South Australia had no funerals at all allowed to be held. Families unable to travel from overseas or interstate, increased risk of contagion when handling the deceased bodies, but also for those working at funerals, for celebrants and funeral directors. And we also have this kind of huge and connected phenomenon of people who are dying alone in palliative care or aged care because visitation has been limited. So in some ways, it's a kind of interconnected and I think probably unexpected impact that COVID has had on death care. And perhaps that has actually allowed us to see the continuities and discontinuities between the industry and how it's structured in Australia. So we can really see the impact of like connectedness and disconnectedness at the same time then when talking about death care workers and talking to death care workers, as I have been. And in many ways, a lot of them have been telling me they feel more disconnected. So you're forced to wear masks when you know, speaking a funeral, and that kind of creates a, you know, a physical and visual layer between yourself and the audience you might be speaking to. You're unable to connect with families in their homes to make the initial arrangements. But it also provokes, and this is what I think is interesting, kind of unexpected intimacies. So a Catholic priest who we were talking to who conducts funerals, he kind of said, you know, when there's only 10 people at a funeral, you can't hide in the back row of the church, right? And his performances as a funeral director, as a celebrant, had to be a lot more personal and meaningful and intimate because there was only 10 people and they had to actually kind of really communicate with them. Similarly, we've done some work with the Melbourne Shevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society. And the intimacies that they experienced were almost more global. So when the first wave of the virus hit New York, for example, they were on the phone to kind of other Orthodox Jewish communities over there, and they, as I'm sure everyone did, saw these kind of shocking images of waves and waves of the dead, you know, some being stored in refrigerator trucks or buried hastily in the middle of the night. And that transformed their experience of the pandemic in Melbourne in a local experience very differently, because they kind of expected it to be this mass death event from the very start. So thinking about 2020 as a potent mix of intimacy and distance, connection and disconnection, is in some ways a new framing, but I think also this has always been part of death care. I think people who work in death care are very good at dealing with that weird alchemy of absence and presence, right? Of kind of contradictory modes of being in the world and of being with someone who's both disappeared from the world, but also very much there and very real. So I actually think that, you know, coming to the kind of the conclusion of this first part of research, what we're finding is that people who work in death care are actually particularly well placed to kind of navigate those contradictory experiences and challenging experiences. So in kind of closing, I've been asked by Sarah to give some kind of bold and provocative future forward statements in regard to the future direction of the industry, which I will put some caveats on by saying that our initial report from the COVID research will probably be released, our white paper will be released at the end of the year, and I'll make sure that everyone who's attending this event is able to access it. But with all those caveats, I think I'll just be very unacademic and just make some stick and slide comments about the industry and change. So what we found is that probably digital innovation in operations, so things like the issuing of digital death certificates, etc., is here to stay, which is great for a lot of people. Zoom is probably here to stay. It's a welcome relief for many, but it's not necessarily the preferred choice. So the adoption of that technology kind of was kick-started by the pandemic. But I think actually particularly ironically, what we've actually seen in the public discourse is a reconfirmation of the moral value of in-person attendance at funerals. So a lot of the biggest controversies that happened in Australia around lockdown and restrictions were about people unable to cross borders to attend funerals. And so Zoom is here, but it's not the preferred choice, and actually being there in person has been reconfirmed as a moral value. A second finding is that disjunctures in the industry and the death care space between aged care, palliative care, the funeral industry, between, I suppose what Mel would talk about, you know, this kind of later stage of life, active aging, active dying, and then death and afterlife remain, and I think have become worse in response to the COVID epidemic. There's always been a kind of disjuncture between aged care and death, and the funeral industry not talking to palliative care and those kind of things. I think COVID has demonstrated just how terrible the kind of consequences of that can be, and how much they need to be fixed. Similarly, power disparities in the industry between large players, large funeral homes, and smaller independent players have been exacerbated by the industry. So particularly around who has brick and mortar chapels or facilities and who is unable to access those. So flexibility was not necessarily an advantage in lockdown for those kind of players. And finally, I think the kind of finding we've had, and maybe this will lead into Steph's comments, is that the normative idea of a standard funeral service has shown deeper and deeper cracks, right? So one of the bizarre things about the funeral industry is that, you know, consumer behaviour, but what people do is usually tied up really strongly in cultural tradition and social expectation. So I'm going to have that funeral because that's what you're supposed to do, this idea of what you're supposed to do. But because people have been forced, in this case, to reinvent the wheel and do differently, they perhaps now are more aware of their freedom around funerals, and funerals that break the mould. And I think that's really exciting for some people working in the funeral death care sector, and that might be terrifying for other established players in the funeral death care industry. Yeah, so there are my big bold pronouncements, hot off the press. But I think it's a really interesting space to look at an industry which is dealing in itself with both, on the one hand, what seems like massive transformation and a huge degree of inertia at the same time. So hopefully that will connect with the other two as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah. There were so many amazing themes that you picked up on there, and I think just from scanning the chat and who we've got in the audience, I think there's now starting to feel like there's actually a community of people who will come, who will design, who will think, who will occupy the liminal spaces and be the advocates. And, you know, for example, I know there's someone from BDM in the chat who might have found it interesting that your pronouncement that maybe digital certificates are here to stay. So again, thank you everyone. There are so many amazing threads coming together. And Stephanie, I would love to hear from your firsthand experience of the last 6 months.
So you probably saw lots of head nodding from me through Hannah's presentation. Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Portable, for organising this. Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to talk about my role in the death care profession as a final responder, and my experience particularly, and trauma, as one of the invisible faces of COVID-19. And I'm going to begin with part of a letter that I wrote back in August after I was placed in quarantine, that was published by an American magazine, Memento Mori. And I'm reading this probably mostly so I don't go on a big rant, but anyway, it does speak to my, my lived experience at this time. So throughout the past 6 months, we have justifiably heard praise for our first responders and our healthcare workers. But what about our final responders? What about the transfer teams, the mortuary staff, the funeral directors, the chapel attendants and celebrants who risk their safety and the safety of their families every time they serve a family affected by the virus? Like healthcare work, many of the jobs in the death care profession are physically demanding and emotionally exhausting. Transfer teams work around the clock on grueling shifts. Funeral staff are often on call, working weekends and evenings. Celebrants and clergy comfort families through their most vulnerable days. And like healthcare, the remuneration in the death care profession does not match the long hours, the stress and the trauma of the work. Additionally, death care work is often stigmatised. I've seen the discomfort on strangers' faces when they ask me what I do for a living and their reluctance to ask me anything about my work as a funeral celebrant. We, however, are not ghouls. We're parents and grandparents. We're yogis and surfers and musicians, wine experts, car enthusiasts, mountain bike riders, all sorts of people. And, you know, most of all, we're people who consider our work vocational and extremely important. And I'm writing this as I sit in my bedroom in quarantine after being identified as a confirmed close contact. 4 people at a funeral service that I led last week have tested positive for COVID-19. It's really hard to push aside the feelings of resentment that are mixed up with the fear and anxiety of awaiting test results while enduring the next 14 days literally under bedroom arrest. Perhaps this pandemic has made you consider your mortality. With the work that I do, that's something that I consider every day of my life. While imagining that, please try to understand how seriously we take our jobs and that as final responders, we should not be the invisible faces of COVID-19. So the good news is that I didn't have COVID, but I did have 2 weeks to take stock of the months leading up to my quarantine and to, you know, seriously consider how I was going to move forward as a funeral professional in a safe way. In Australia, Hannah, as you've kind of alluded to, the death care profession is unregulated. There is no organisation that provides us with government and legislative reports or updates that are pertinent to the professional or advisors on products or industry services. I'm actually a member of the ICCFA, which is the International Cemetery, Cremation and Funeral Association. It's an American organisation, but they wholly and solely represent and advocate for US funeral professionals. And in doing so, they provide really excellent educational networking and legislative guidance to their members. Throughout this year, what I've seen the ICCFA do particularly well is support their members with, you know, sometimes daily updates, offering support on a whole range of COVID-related issues. In fact, they've just advocated to get all funeral professionals top priority on the COVID vaccine. They were so quick getting information out on PPE supplies and also changing limitations on gatherings. And, you know, only last week they sent this beautiful thank you video to all of their members, showcasing the important work that funeral professionals have done during COVID and the pandemic. There's been nothing like that from the funeral profession here in Australia. So every precaution that I take, you know, I've initiated myself. All the research I've done through the Department of Health and Human Services sites, as well as, you know, the information from the ICCFA has been pretty helpful too. But, you know, cleaning workspaces, disinfecting microphones, not visiting family homes, all the PPE I provide for myself, masks, gloves, disinfectant, wipes, but that's just the practical stuff. Harder to manage has been the emotional toll of the pandemic and working with families who've had to deal with so much more than the loss of a family member or a friend during this period. The very first COVID service that I did was back in April during the first lockdown. And, you know, it was like all funerals, it was, I mean, this one was incredibly sad. The deceased's daughter, who was her only child, had been caring for her mum. And her mother at the time was undergoing cancer treatment. And after she was hospitalised with complications from that cancer treatment, she then tested positive for COVID. And her daughter was only allowed to see her for half an hour each day, again in full PPE, and, you know, was unable to have any sort of physical contact with her. losing her mother was hard enough, and having to deal with all the restrictions imposed during those final weeks was, incredibly distressing to her. But to make matters even worse, she then had to face questions and accusations from her friends and from an extended family that she'd been the one to give her mother COVID, as she'd been the one caring for her. No, she did 3 negative tests and it wasn't her. But that kind of, trauma was so real and awful to her. So, in Victoria, we came out of that first lockdown with 19 COVID deaths. And I hoped at that stage that would be the one and only COVID funeral that I would lead. But by August, every single funeral service that I was leading was for a COVID death. And the trauma that these families were experiencing was like nothing I have ever seen in the more than 10 years that I've been doing this job. There was trauma, as you've mentioned, Hannah, at not having access to a family member in an aged care facility. And sometimes that family member had dementia and had no understanding of why their family all of a sudden was not turning up anymore. There was the trauma of having to say goodbye over an iPad and not being able to, hold that person's hand and say goodbye in person. The trauma of having to, again, you've alluded to this, Hannah, trauma of having to organise a funeral service with only 10 allowed and then telling important family members, well, sorry, you're not allowed to come. The trauma of not being able to travel interstate or overseas to attend the funeral of a parent or a family member. The trauma of not being able to grieve as a community and returning to empty homes. In September, one of the most devastating things that happened to me was I led a service for a 94-year-old woman. And then 10 days later, I led a service for her 63-year-old son who went home that night from his mother's funeral service and took his life because he just couldn't face the grief and the loneliness on his own. Grief, as we know, is a collection of emotions. And the grief that these families have experienced incorporates significant trauma. So, now that we kind of feel that we're on the other side of that second wave of the pandemic, I just wonder, what are we going to do with all of this trauma? As grieving families, as healthcare and aged care workers, as funeral professionals, for me, the pandemic has really highlighted the need for some sort of organised representation and support, certainly for death care professionals here in Australia.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's honestly left me a bit speechless, Stephanie.
Sorry, I didn't want it to turn into a rant, but I am, I am feeling exhausted, and, it's been a time where none of us have taken a break for months and months and months, and it's just been relentless, and it's been so hard and so sad.
And I think, sorry to jump in, Sarah, but I think that's one of the things that that people don't recognise, or that, talking to other people in this sector, it's not just that they did this job that was incredibly harrowing, and in some ways it's always contained a bit of harrowing kind of grief experience, but then, a lot of people then went home after working in the mortuary for 12 hours on COVID deceased, and then got home, and because of the curfew, they weren't able to see anyone or walk their dog even, or leave the house, and they were living alone, you know what I mean? And so they went home to an empty house with all the thoughts of that day, and then went back to work the next morning to do more COVID death prep, so that these are people too, I suppose, is the bottom line. Very much so, Steph.
I think both of those comments just really highlight the impact on a range of workforces and the resilience that has been needed and shown so incredibly, and also just forces us to think about what those workforces need to go forward. Because there's a long tail here, as we all know. So I think we've been really exploring that in aged care and home care, and thank you for bringing my attention to that last responders experience with such emotion, Stephanie. I really, really appreciated the letter and the way you framed that, because it's not talked about often enough, the critical role that part of the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. You've shared really deep experiences, all coming from very different perspectives. So I guess with 20 minutes left, I'd like to invite our audience to use the Q&A channel to pop, not only questions, but also comments, things that you're observing. We've got people coming, from different countries as well. And I'm really curious to understand what your experiences have been like. I think there's something interesting. When we started this research a couple of years ago, we were thinking peak death is something, that demographers project about 30 years in the future, when you're thinking about Australia. And then 2020 happened, and it's exposed a system under duress: aged care, death care, end of life planning. And I think one of the opportunities we're seeing is people have really felt the acceleration of a smooth peak. We thought, we've got a little while, we can build up to this, and we actually didn't. And I think the opportunity now is that we've got people's awareness. We've got, more than their awareness, we've got the population thinking and feeling about this. And what can we do about this? What can we do about the hurt, the pain, the anger, and maybe the empathy, and channel this emotion into something really smart in 2021 and beyond?
Sarah, I came across a really, really good quote for me. This is back in June, July, and I actually have rudely forgotten the author, but it said, there are decades when weeks happen, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think we've lived that this year, and maybe the opportunities to kind of try and hang on to that a little bit in terms of the need to accelerate some of these improvements.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest, I think we've all touched on this, is kind of different disconnections, discontinuities between kind of different parts of how the death experience broadly imagined is managed and engaged with, whether that be, funeral directors not talking to celebrants, not talking to mortuary staff, not talking to cemeteries, or aged care and palliative care not talking to death care at all. And because of that, because of the very nature of that industry, particularly in Australia, but also I suppose I know overseas as well, there's really, as you say, Steph, the lack of kind of a body that represents and speaks for everyone and speaks to everyone, for various kind of historical, political, economical reasons. Like, there's a lot of, I suppose, competition between kind of different arms of that field that all should really be trying to work together, and not having a kind of single, not only not having a single body, but not having like a government department that you can call up and say, COVID, what can I do at a funeral tomorrow? Can you clarify that with me? Has been really, really difficult and added a lot more unnecessary uncertainty into people's experience of working.
So in a perfect world, Hannah,
yeah,
death care would be part of healthcare.
Yeah.
Just because a body, ceased to heart ceased to beat and ceased to breathe, it's still a body. But what we have done is commodified death. So unfortunately, you'll never get palliative care and death care people speaking to each other, because death care workers would be considered preying on vulnerable people at the end of their life, trying to generate business, because it is a commercial business. That's therein lies the problem. So you need to make death care part of healthcare under the same umbrella. But
I think part of healthcare without overly medicalising, that's also the difficult challenge as well, right? Right. So make it part of healthcare, but then also acknowledge the expertise that a lot of people have that aren't, medical doctors, right? Which is all these big dreams, but things we need to move towards, I think.
And also just to think about the customer experience, the family experience of that segregation that you've just described. When there's so much uncertainty and emotion and trauma in those experiences, and the separation of services and the kind of full stops and end points, and the lack of clarity about where to or what might be needed, what might be the best decisions. It's such a terribly bumpy experience for people, for families.
Yeah, and for instance, if you're in a palliative care facility, if you ask a palliative care nurse to recommend a funeral director, they're not allowed to. So, there's a complete disconnect between the two.
Yeah.
So people can't get information because they're not allowed to pass that information on. So it's very hard.
Yeah. I think that burden is then passed back onto the family, but I think we are actually seeing the government take some really interesting steps to potentially provide the infrastructure around that. And I can't really say too much more apart from I can't wait to see how we respond from the public sector, from the private sector. There is quite a bunch of innovation happening with that kind of, how can we put the human experience at the center of this, all the way through, and support a family and support someone really well. We've got a couple of pretty cool questions on our Q&A, so I'm going to maybe just read them out and then hand over to one of our panelists each. So from Ellen, please clarify how death experience design differs from a good death. Are there any presenters aware of people in America who are thinking about death experience design? I actually don't know who's best placed to answer this, so go
Mel?
for it.
Mel, maybe?
I think there's been some fabulous work in the States over the last decade, from businesses like IDEO through to BJ Miller's work, through to some of the great work that Atul Gawande has been leading, and in other countries as well. So there's some fantastic work. I don't think there's been enough of that getting to scale. It's still in its kind of emerging early stages. But your first question, Helen, around this idea of death experience design to good death. I mean, I think my organisation, Violet, doesn't really advocate for the idea of a good death, because it's really hard to measure that, and it's not always possible. And sometimes that's about place of death and a whole lot of things that have huge variables. And sometimes things like safety, can come into this unforeseen, and decisions can change as a result. So it's actually about understanding what that person would want. What is the experience that they would want to have in the last 12 months, the last 6 months, 6 weeks or days of their life? And actually, how would we think about that now? How would that inform our planning and choices going forward? So yeah, a good death is maybe good for some, but I don't think universal. I think it makes a lot of people feel like they're being set up to fail, actually. It's difficult language sometimes.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on that, Hannah or Stephanie?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. A good death was originally a concept that kind of sociologists and psychologists came up with to try and talk about how we imagine death as, like, the classically is like 90-year-old asleep, surrounded by loved ones dying in their sleep, and kind of talk about how we kind of attach moral value to dying in certain ways, and what we kind of, how we judge death. So basically the idea that death is not neutral. I think, it has been picked up by a lot of the kind of what might be called kind of death positivity, death literacy kind of movement. But I have seen people kind of moving away from it or step back from it recently, because exactly what you say, if you kind of codify one thing as a good death, does that mean you can have a suboptimal death or a not as good death, right? And also, I think it's important also to realize that the idea of a good death is very political, and only some people in our society are even given the privilege to be able to imagine it, right? So not only is that concept diverse, but also then it becomes part of power structures. And I think rather than saying this is a good death, it's more important to kind of meet people where they are, which is exactly what you guys are trying to do. Yeah.
I think too, in Victoria, we have some fairly remarkable legislation on care planning, and also around voluntary assisted dying. So, you know, there's a certain amount of planning that you can do. And, you know, like I say to my families, if I'm ever called in to see a family, if somebody's in palliative care and they want to pre-arrange their funeral before they die, I just, you know, to tell them whatever they can do before that event happens is going to help them enormously after that event happens. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we have got great legislation in Victoria. I think, you know, Advanced Care Planning Australia is a good organisation to start with. There's some really useful information there. Document stuff, talk about it, especially with family, write it down, put it somewhere safe.
Absolutely. I think when one of the things we discovered early on is that there's a real movement to support people planning and thinking and talking about that and documenting it somewhere that's accessible for both them to keep up to date with their preferences, but also people who need to access it for them or on their behalf to execute on those preferences. But we kind of felt, or we were seeing that there was a whole bunch of, I don't know, 20, 30 somethings who were started to become interested, and we thought, okay, they're not quite ready to, you know, even write a will or think about their death on that term. But if we hold a space very optimistically and a little bit problematically by saying, if you could design your death, what would that look like? Mm-hmm. Acknowledging that you're right, Hannah, it's not possible for everyone. But we designed a survey. It was called Design Your Death. I think it's still up, designyourdeath.com.au, and it basically asks you to think about what your ideal experience might be like in your final 3 days. And what we found was, like, not that the research collected revealed anything like dramatically new about what people love. They want their family around, they want it to be in a beautiful space. But we found that in writing that down and expressing it and then doing the simple act of sending it back to them as a PDF, what they had was something very simple that they could share, and for the first time allowed them to maybe take that next step of saying, I know it's ridiculous, but like, if I were ever to die unexpectedly, I realize that it's more important for me that you just have a party. Like, do not worry about this and do not worry about that. I know you'll struggle to describe me in my obituary, but this is a chance that I can define myself. So, you know, in my wildest dreams, I'd love to represent myself in my obituary as these 3 words. And it kind of opened up a space. It wasn't about, you know, a constraint-based thinking about what death is like. It was about, what can it be? And I think that what can it be space, while we do have the luxury to think about it, is something very powerful to lean into.
Yeah, it is, Sarah. And I guess there's also a healthy dissonance, you know, when you're able to think about these things with the safety of time and health. What we understand is that when people are actually approaching that last stage, or in fact in it, the behavioural barriers are very complex. You know, the fear, the grief, the all of that kind of very heavy sea of emotions really can get in the way of that. But it's helping individuals and families with that understanding and gentle acknowledgement that can be so transformational. You know, there's often a real hunger or an appetite for it in some parts of a family conversation, but real blockages in others. But it's a really important part of the work.
I also just kind of on this notion of good death and planning and death positivity, I suppose, is that this might be a bit of a personal rant, but I think people for designing death or thinking about design, I think there's a kind of real danger in kind of this attempt or this desire to optimize death, and that kind of that we have to be overly positive about it, and that, you know, it has to be this beautiful and amazing experience that's good and transformative. And I think for some people it could be, but actually kind of just acknowledging that it's actually really hard and difficult and sad and shit, you know, a lot of the time for a lot of people. I think that's, you know, I think there's a tendency, that kind of techno-salvationism, like techno-solutionism, right? Like, we're not, I mean, some people want to, but we're not going to solve death by introducing an app or, you know, well, some people want to cryogenically freeze themselves, etc. But, you know, we have to be, you know, careful that in talking about good deaths or death positivity, or, you know, that we're not getting into that idea that you can make every death experience a positive experience, because it's never going to be for many people. And like, again, what you guys talking about, like actually acknowledging that and meeting people in the reality of that is much more important than trying to make every death into a good death, I think.
Yeah, really feel that. We probably can take one more question. And it's from Dora. So Dora is an industrial design student, and for honours, she's focusing on designing for death. Any key literature, books, papers that deal and detail the problems with death, the death industry is facing, that you would recommend? This is a really rich space, and there's a few questions as well in the chat channel about like, where can I find resources so I understand more about this topic. And also, dear panelists, it's probably a good time to invite you to say where people can connect with you or read more of your work too. So maybe Hannah, we'll start with you, move to Melissa, and then finish with Stephanie.
Yeah, I'm not, she says she's an honours student, so I would assume she's based in Australia maybe. Well, for the death industry and kind of death kind of area in Australia, obviously Portable's resources, but our website deathtech.org has all of our research papers and conference papers and a lot of the work we've been doing in this space. Some of them are kind of behind an academic paywall, but if you just reach out to me by email, we're happy to send them through to you. And then I think in particular for kind of Australian-based stuff, we've also just launched this year, very excitingly, the Australian Death Studies Society, which is going to be a kind of scholarly society for anyone who wants to conduct or is conducting research into death, and death cultures. So that's at deathstudies.com. deathstudies.org. So deathtech.org and deathstudies.org. I'm available there. You can also contact me at Twitter. I'm at HRHGOULD. I'll pop that in the chat right now for everyone. Awesome.
Thanks, Hannah. I guess that I kind of, dive into some fantastic reading. I'm going to lean on the wonderful work of a lot of the members of our clinical committee, Catherine Mannix, Ken Hillman, and locally here, Margaret Rice. So I'd encourage you to check out some of their incredible works. I guess more directly, for anybody that needs support, for anybody that is caring for someone in this last life stage or knows somebody that is, I would really welcome you to look at violet.org.au. We can connect you with a Violet guide really easily. It's free. It's a 24/7 service. Also for any businesses or organisations who would be interested in the capability that the workforce training, that's all available in the same place. You can reach out to me at mreader at violet.org.au, or my Twitter handle is VioletCEO. So really love to hear further questions or other ways to connect with everyone that's joined the session.
I'll bring everyone's attention to a fantastic virtual conference that's happening in December called End Well. They're an amazing organisation. I attended the inaugural conference in San Francisco. It must have been 3 or 4 years ago now. But it's just grown and grown and grown, and this year it's virtual. It's free. If you go on to endwell.org, there are so many extraordinary speakers speaking at that conference. You probably have to get up in the middle of the night because it will be on West Coast time. But yeah, I'm going to plan to take that day off just because there's so many people that I want to hear speak. I've also posted my details in the chat, so if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'd love to chat to you.
Thank you, everyone in the audiences for sharing fantastic resources as well as we've been going. Thank you, panelists, for sharing experiences, bringing me to the edge of tears and wanting to come back, and it's just like recommitted myself to the work that we have ahead of us. Thank you. We'll be sending a follow-up, and we'll try and include the references that have been provided by the panelists and I also just wanted to say there's a lot that you can sign up online to do and read and books to buy, but you also have a community, and you will be part of a community, and parts of your community will probably be really interested in talking to you about what death experience means, and actually maybe the resources that you need are closer than you think, and they may not be online, and they may not be in a book. So remember, I think that part of it too, and keep safe, stay well. Thank you so much.